And welcome back. My name is Steven, and I'm here to teach you more about C#, the .NET platform, and Windows. In this particular episode, we're talking about C# error handling. What are the good ways, well, maybe not the bad ways, but the good ways of handling errors and exceptions. We talked about last week debugging. Very brief, I know it was an hour and 12 minutes, I apologize. But a brief introduction into what it looks like to debug a C# application, and some of the mentality that goes behind that. In this particular episode, we're going to talk about the practical aspect of that debugging and how to prevent the entire program from dying and crashing. It's actually called dying in the industry. You'll see similar code to the file IO, only I've trimmed it down quite a bit in this particular solution. We're pretty much only going to cover this one aspect of it because this will cover a lot of ground for your debugging. There will be some references or some examples that I give later on how to properly structure ifs to prevent some confusion and some of the semantic errors that can result from that. In this case, let's talk about try catch. The try catch clause is implemented inside of your code, just like every other piece that we've written so far. We're once again working with this button output values event, and here is our file. Now you'll see var written here. This is what's known as a dynamic variable type. Var just is short for variable. Essentially this gets assigned based on what is to the right of the set value to operator, this equals sign. So in this case, read all text returns a string, and so this var will evaluate file as a string variable. It's really handy if you don't know exactly what kind of variable you're going to be handling, especially if you're working on somebody else's code. So if I were to do this right now, I don't have a temp file that exists on my system. So if I hit start, you'll see the code rendered into this form. We've got our values here. If I hit output values, we get this file not found exception. Could not find file c/tempfile.txt. Now that is expected because we know that file doesn't exist. But how do we handle that? How do we get proper values to prevent my application from crashing and still returning maybe an error log that I could read this later, or I could attach to process and read this? We will talk about attached to process today. So we're going to close out of our debugging, and I will type out what a try catch looks like. It's real basic. There is a third clause to this, which is used in some cases. I don't see it as much in C#, at least in the industry, because it can also just be handled by removing the finally and doing some code do something here. Essentially, let's actually just walk through the blocks here. So a try block means we're going to attempt to operate this code. Whatever is in between curly bracket opening and closing, we're going to try to execute commands that the programmer has typed in here. And if something happens, if an error that happens that would otherwise break, in this case a file not found exception because this file doesn't exist, we will catch that error and we will do something with it here. Ultimately, regardless of the state of try or catch, you can do a finally statement to then execute code after the catch. You don't have to do a finally. The finally is optional, but if you do a try, you must have a catch to catch any errors. This do something here can also be written instead of doing the finally. There are a number of ways to handle that. The exact use of finally is actually in relevance to the try catch specifically. And there's some interesting interplay that can happen there, which we won't get into because, again, you're probably not going to see a ton of it in the industry for C# specifically. When we get into our Java course, if we actually do one, we'll talk a little bit more about the implications of finally there, I'm sure. try catch is not a conditional necessarily, at least not in the traditional sense, because try does check for successful execution through the compiler, and if that is false in a meta kind of way, then it goes to this catch clause. However, there's no if or any parameters that you pass into try, at least in C#. But in catch, you can put in your parentheses, and you can put in any kind of exception that pops up in this list. You can see access violation, aggregate, app domain unloaded, and you can sort through these, and the tooltips will show you exactly what each of those exception handlers do. If you're not sure what kind of exception is going to be thrown, you can just leave it as exception, which is what I actually do most of the time. I don't like to be very specific with the exception caused, because I feel like the more general and the more generic you can be with your error messages to catch them, and more specific in your logs, the better off you'll be. Here we're going to have to assign a variable value for the exception, because this is an object that is created when code fails, and I like to use the term EX. I said in a previous video that I like to use E a lot. I don't in C# because that's often your event args that are passed into these event handlers. So in this case we'll do EX. I apologize, I misspoke in the previous episode. So what do we do with EX? What can we see from the exception object? And where do I output those values? What does that look like? Well, it's actually really simple. Anything you want. In this case, say I want to put it to our output log. You may notice, by the way, that I don't have my Solution Explorer or my error list or my output windows. That's because I have them on another screen. If you prefer that I leave them all on the same screen, I prefer not to have them cluttered, but if you prefer, for visibility's sake, to have them here, I will drag it over to show you when I'm referencing specific things, but I'd rather not have it on my main screen. But let me know if it works better the other way. For now, because we are relevantly working with the output, or referencing it, I will tell you that you can do console.writeLine EX, but if you just type in EX, it's going to write out something like console or Microsoft.windows.forms.exception or something like that. We want to access properties within the exception object. So we'll do dot to get to our sub items, and now you can find all of the data you could possibly need out of that generic exception. There are a couple that I prefer to do. You'll see the starred favorites are most used in the window in the tooltip that pops up. I do message, and I also like to put stack trace. So the way that I typically do that, it is a little bit more complex than you would normally see, a little bit more complex than you have seen in the videos so far. I like to do an error message. String.format is a way to do what's known as string interpolation. I didn't cover that in our primitives because I didn't think it was relevant to a basics episode. String interpolation essentially takes specific characters of a string and replaces them with values you've entered into an args list or an arguments list at the end of the method. I'll give you an example because it's a little bit weird to try to explain it without that. So in this case, we're going to say error message, and we're going to do backslash n, and what that's going to do is a new line twice. So it's essentially the same as hitting enter twice on a text editor. And then we're going to do a curly bracket, 0 curly bracket. We're going to do backslash n, and then we're going to do stack trace, double backslash n, and then we're going to do 1 inside of curly brackets. This is very reminiscent of our array manipulation because these are indexes. What are they indexes referencing? The arguments after our string implemented via or passed in via the string.format method. So in this case, we'll do ex.message because our error message comes first, followed by ex.stacktrace because that's what comes second. And then rather than writing that all in the console.writeLine method, now we can just pass in the error message string that we've constructed up here. You'll see people refer to string builder, which I personally feel is a lot more robust and a lot more useful for complex situations. I don't use string builder a whole lot. I don't have a need for it very often. String.format is amazing. There are other ways to do string interpolation, like I believe it is, I think it's $, yeah. So $, and you can do error message, something like that. And then I think here it is a %s. I don't do string interpolation this way very often because I don't find it as legible. Yeah. I think that's how you do this one. We're learning here together, folks. And it's important that you know that it's okay to not know things. It's okay to Google. It's okay to look things up. So in this case, I want to do $, C# string interpolation. And we'll look for our Stack Overflow. And it looks like the proper syntax, they're doing that seems, okay, that makes a lot more sense. It's not %s. I apologize. Instead, you're going to do your curly brackets right here and do message like that, and then so these two statements are the exact same. And we found that with our good old friend Stack Overflow that we talked about before. Incredibly useful. And even the experts, I, use this all the time. There's no way anybody should ever expect you to remember every little bit of the C# language. You will pick up and you will memorize and you will keep track of things that you use most often, as you would with any position. But for somebody to require you to know these by heart is insane. You can look up this syntax very easily, very quickly, and get the job done pretty much just as quickly as anybody else would. But we're going to try them out because now I'm interested. I'm going to call this interpolated error message. I moved around with the arrow keys. I do that a lot in code. Sometimes it's just faster than using a mouse. Personal preference. When you rename something like this, so it was error MSG, you can hit Alt-Enter while hovering over it without having clicked or typed anything else, and it will offer you the option to rename this particular variable and all the references to it so that you can get your naming more accurate without having to type a bunch. In this case, I prefer the more verbose. And actually, what we could do is call this the primary error message. And we'll rename it to that using Alt-Enter, Enter. So let's see what happens. Ideally, when we compile this, our output window should show our stack trace and our error message because of this primary error message. going to pin that right there. We're going to hit output values. Error message. Could not find the file. C:\tempfile.exe. And our stack trace, our new line, goes from here to here. And then the next new line goes to here. And this says at system.io.error.winIOError. And I believe we covered this in the previous episode. Most of these don't matter in your work. You will find that there are a lot of libraries referenced in especially established code bases. When you get down to the areas that you start to recognize, you can then reverse engineer where the error is populating from there. In this case, we see it's an internal read all text. Well, I know I called something similar to read all text in my file IO, in this case my file read, in my button outputs click event handler, or output values. Read all text, oh hey, there's that method that I typed. At firstapplication.form1.buttonOutputValuesClick, that's my event handler. So I've got an error in my event handler. Oh, and hey, specifically, here's my file path. So if I can't open it in Visual Studio, or I don't want to, I can open it elsewhere in, say, Visual Studio Code or Notepad++ or whatever, and still edit my code directly here from that file. And then you just go to line 43, and you can press Control G, brings up this dialog. You can type in your line number, and it will put your cursor right on the line that is erroring out. In this case, our file. So now let's try it with our string interpolated. Hopefully, it should do the exact same thing. And it does. So our string interpolation syntax works like that. You do $sign to prefix your string value, and then you do curly brackets around your variables that you're passing in. In this case, ex.message or ex.stacktrace. This is a shorthand format of string.format error message, and then doing the indexing stuff here. This 0 references the 0th argument, which is message, and this one references the first position, which is the first index, which is the second position, which is our stack trace. Either of these are valid. Write it how you like to, or how the code base that you're working with requires you to. Now you may remember that before our program broke and crashed. A lot of times if you don't have access to the code, that is represented by the fact that your window grays out or gets this matte finish to it, this glossed overlook to it or whatever. I know matte and gloss are two different things, bear with me. But it gets this white screen over it, and it says not responding in the title bar right next to the name of the program that you're writing. That is an app crash, and that's usually because of an exception or some sort of timeout or something like that, which is, again, another exception. In this case, because we've handled our exception, our form doesn't lock up, it doesn't fail, and it doesn't crash. In fact, my form still continues to work despite the fact that I've got these stack trace issues and exceptions. Pretty cool, right? So what if I want to display to the user that those output values didn't do anything? I don't want them to see the entire stack trace. That seems like overkill. Just going to remove that for cleanliness. But I still want that error to go to the console because I can attach to process later. In this case, you can do a message box. Message box.show. Let's do output values failed. I have a tendency to capitalize the first letter of words that don't start a sentence and are not proper nouns. I apologize. It's kind of annoying. Output values failed. Please try again later. And that is a totally valid thing to type out, but I like to make it a little bit nicer because otherwise it's just kind of a plain error message. Let's do caption, which is the title, which is an odd name for it because everything else uses title. Let's say error outputting values. And I'm fat fingering like mad today, whatever it is. And here I can just hit enter because it's auto-suggesting the message box.buttons. Hit dot, and there are my options. I don't want yes or no. I don't want yes, no, cancel. I don't want okay, cancel. I don't want abort, retry, ignore. I don't want any of that. I just want okay, because they can't do anything about it. They're just going to hit okay. I'm going to hit comma, and then I'm going to go down to message box icon and hit dot, and then I have some options here. These can be misleading because I'm pretty sure a lot of them just use the same icon set. Oh well. In this case, I want them to know that there was an error. Excuse me. I want them to know there's an error involved when the error happens. So now, if I hit output values, we get this. If I didn't include all of these other arguments, say I just did a bare bones copy, comment out, and remove all of these, we would just get something very plain like this. I don't really know if this is an error or if it's a notification to me of something ancillary. I don't know what's going on. When you're working with error messages, there's nothing more frustrating for a user than to not know what's going on. They don't want to have to call tech support. They just want to know, hey, oh, my keyboard isn't working. Or they just want to know that they tried to submit something and it did go through, but it's not returning to the screen. They may have to refresh. Something like that. For this, because it's a total failure, we say the output values failed. Please try again later. This indicates that the input that was attempted, or the function that was attempted, was not capable of being executed, and therefore, hey, just so you know, whatever work you just performed that you tried to save or that you tried to recall failed. This is verbose enough for them to know, okay, something failed. We could be a lot more specific. For instance, you can just dump the entire stack trace message in there if you really want to. We can do this. And this is something that I've seen as well. I've seen custom pop-up windows that do something like this. This you can absolutely do. And I will say, I don't recommend it. Because any malicious user that has access to the program for a few minutes and runs across an error can determine database names, table names. They can access pertinent information. They can access pins, passwords, things like that if they've been poorly coded. It's not a great way to handle it. But what you can do, instead of having all of that written out, is just output it to your output log. That way when you attach the process to debug it, you can access it there. Otherwise, you could also log that error, that specific error, to a database. I had a train of thought on something else that we could do, and I can't for the life of me remember what it was. Something about this triggered a thought. Could not file. You could just do the error message itself and not the stack trace, and that would be safer. For instance, you could just do ex.message. Could not find the file, and you'll actually see this done more frequently than the other way that I was doing it. Although I'm curious, and bear with me, because I like to break things. Let's see if we can wreck the title bar of our it just truncates. That's unfortunate. Man, I wish I remembered I wish I remembered what I was going to show you, because there was something that kept popping into my head about specifically that message box. And it's just not coming to mind. We'll move on for now. If it comes back to me, it comes back to me. Otherwise, during my editing process, I might throw a slide in or something like that that just says, hey, this is what I came up with, or some future me version will be edited in. I doubt it, but we're going to keep moving. We have successfully now handled an error. Something was attempted, it breaks, it enters into here, and we get detailed information that we can then access. If we were to say, deploy this, and we'll go over deployments at a later date. So I'm just going to kind of fly through this real quick. And we will go to... This is our application without Visual Studio running. This is just a program that we have installed on our program or on our operating system. Accessible through the Start menu, first application, fully functional. Nothing happens because we didn't tell it to show a message, because I commented that line out. So how do we attach to process? How do we see that error message after we've gone into production? Well, you go into Visual Studio and we go to debug. We go to attach to process, Control Alt P. This will bring up a list of processes. If you are not an administrator on your computer, say you're using a company laptop or a company computer of some sort, and you don't have administrative domain access, you may not be able to see all the processes that are being run, because the programs might be run as an administrator. In this case, I am the administrator, and if you're on your personal PC, odds are you are as well. If you're not, you can check this Show Processes from All Users. That's fairly simple. So we're going to scroll through this list and find our first application. It should be alphabetical based on process name. And first application.exe. Executable. Form main. Well, we know that our particular app is form main for the title. So we're going to attach that process. And hey, we've got that same orange bar as though we're debugging our program, or as though we're running our program straight out of Visual Studio, but we didn't click play. We've attached our code base to the symbols generated and the output generated by our installed instance. This is an incredibly useful debugging and error handling feature. I didn't mention it last week because it was an hour and 12 minutes. What can I say? Not everything can be crammed, packed into one lesson. So in this particular case, we're attaching to process post-release, and I need to see this console.writeLine interpolated error message, right? Or I need to set a breakpoint, because I can absolutely do that. Let's hit our output values. Because we have the code base, because we own that code, and we've attached to the process that is made from this code, Visual Studio has paired them up, stitched them together. Sorry, I'm covering my microphone. Has paired them up and stitched them together to make the two debuggable. I don't know exactly how it works. I haven't delved too far deeply into that, but I know that it requires that you have the base source code to the program you're attaching to process. Otherwise, you get a bunch of decompiled gobbledygook that some people are really good at reading, and I am certainly not. I say I'm an expert, but it's not because I've done that stuff. So here we have our breakpoint, just as though we are running this program directly out of Visual Studio. We're going to hit F10, hit our exception because that file does not exist. Interpolated message. Oh. And there's our file IO exception. It looks different because I have specific settings in Visual Studio set up for just my code, which when you're attaching to process doesn't always work. So you can go to Tools, Options, go to the search bar here, type in just my, look for enable just my code. I don't need those either. And hit OK. And I think this should now function no differently than... Oh, interesting. And frustrating. This typically would output directly to our console exactly the error message we're getting. If it doesn't, for whatever reason, we can still look at our interpolated message and see this error message or hover over our exception. You probably won't be doing this particular process for a while, the whole attach to process, but it's good to be familiar with the concept and what you can do in it. Just because it's nice to know what is out there to help us debug. I apologize if you're seeing glare on my glasses. I have two lights that I cannot, for the life of me, seem to prevent the glare on me from and still light my face well enough for you to be able to see me. Sorry. So, I'm also noticing that I'm casting shadows on that wall. It's just a mess. I apologize. Anyway, so let's back out of this. I don't need form main open anymore. I'm going to pop this back over here. How else can you prevent or handle exceptions? Don't let them happen. It sounds really dumb, but basic conditionals based on whether a specific flag has been hit, hitting or having an if selected index of a list box is greater than -1, because the default state of a list box selected item or selected index is -1 until somebody clicks on a list box item, and then it is 0 or greater. You can say if list box dot selected index is greater than -1, go through and do my logic. Or you can say if the list box dot selected index is less than 0, enter into a curly bracket block, one single line, say return. Let's do that quick, just to show you, because let's say you have an event handler where when you click on a specific item, it will then show you the value in a message box. So let's say, in order to create and wire up this particular event, the default for this particular control is to just selection change. So you can double click that control, the list box, and it will automatically make this, just like the button double click made this button add value click. List values selected index changed is the default for list box. So let's say we want to do a message box dot show list values dot selected index, right? No. We want to do items list values dot selected index. So what I'm doing here is I'm creating that basic message box that we looked at before. Our list values, which is what is up front here. We're going to get the current selected index and show it in our message box as a string. Makes sense, right? Oh, okay. You can ignore that error message. How ironic. So let's select bacon. Great. Milk. Great. Eggs. Great. It's kind of annoying though whenever I change my selection on my list box that I get this pop-up. What if I had, say, a button like my output values that did this instead? So that whenever I clicked the button, it would show what I had selected. Milk, output values. Cool. But what if I don't have anything selected at all? I get an exception. My program breaks because selected index is -1. Nothing is selected. In order to remedy that, I can very easily just say if list values dot selected index is less than 0, return. And what that will do is it will break me out of this particular event saying, hey, didn't meet the conditions to function the rest of the code or to allow the rest of the code to function, return to user. And now if nothing is selected, nothing happens. It's a really quick and simple way to get out of hairy situations with your code later. It also prevents nesting if statements and things like that. This is a really great way to make succinct error handling code without having to do try catches. That being said, try catches are abundant, and they are abundant for very good reason. They're very, very useful. To the point where in most Java programs or Java writing programs, IDEs, such as IntelliJ or Oracle's Eclipse, you're forced to handle exceptions through their methods and through try catches and things like that. They will not compile or allow you to compile unless you do so. That's pretty much all that we've got for error handling. That's pretty much how you want to do it. You either want to display the error to the user. Light bulb. I remember what I was going to do. Let's jump back in. I remember. It's a handy dandy trick I learned a few years ago that, let's go back to our file read issue. We don't want to show the user the interpolated error message, right? Because we don't want that security issue. But if debugger, and it will not be in your solution automatically. Alt enter. System.diagnostics should be a using statement. Do is attached. We'll do that. Else message box.show. I don't know how to spell occurred off the top of my head. It just occurred to me. I also forgot the dot show. Cool. Now if I do this and I hit output values, we get this crazy stack trace message. But if I go and I publish my application and I set it up and it starts up for me, I get a clean, user-friendly, not at all technical error message that gives no information to anybody else. Now let's attach to process and see if it allows me to work with that. Yes! There's the use of attached to process. If debugger.isAttached, do this. Otherwise, send a clean, succinct, non-technical error message to the user so that they don't have to feel bogged down by reading through lines and lines and lines of error messages. Because stack traces can be confusing, they're not always obvious, even to programmers. This has been error handling. Super simple, super straightforward, but it's important stuff. Just like I've said in every episode so far. The first number of episodes, and I don't know exactly how many, but the first number of episodes are basics classes to get you in the foundational understanding of how to do this. Programming is not easy. In fact, it can be quite the mind bend, especially if you're coming from a non-technical background. I commend you greatly if you're coming from a non-technical background. Welcome. This is a place for you to learn. Error handling is your first step towards creating a very fluid and clean, user-friendly interface with the data that they need to access, create, and update. Thanks for joining me, and if you have any questions, throw them in the comments below with a timestamp to the video. I will be more than happy to answer whatever I can as soon as I can. Until next time, have a good one.